Hey leaders, welcome into Lead Live. Today, we are talking about COVID-19 and its financial impact. Of course, we're worried about health concerns, its global spread, but now we turn our attention towards the local church, your ministries, nonprofit organizations, and how COVID-19 is impacting our faith and our finances. So in the live stream, let's get to work.
Can't quite hear you there, Clint.
Hey, can you hear me now, bro?
I can. There we go.
Hello.
Okay, great. I can't hear a thing. That's awesome. So we're still seeing the impacts of technology. So Josh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
At all? Okay, you need to take this. So obviously we're in with Daniel, and Daniel is, I just can't hear you guys. So I'm going to try to fix that, and I'll be back into the stream. Let's go ahead, Daniel. Introduce yourself if you can. Problems.
Yeah. So as Clint maybe introduced a little bit at the top of the show, I couldn't hear him, and you might not have either. But my name is Daniel. I actually work currently as a investment advisor and financial planner for a locally owned investment management company in Lexington, Kentucky. But have a sort of a background in ministry and nonprofit prior to this, having spent about 7-8 years for non-denominational church out in Las Vegas, Nevada, where I had the opportunity to serve on the business administration side of things after a small stint as a youth intern. And now have the amazing opportunity to really facilitate ministry through a lot of different board work and sort of being able to help lead from a side and equip and encourage people who are doing the sort of the trench work of ministry leadership. And so that's been a great opportunity to sort of lend both my ministry experience and business experience to help take things off of leaders' plates and really help them in a sort of faithful capacity.
Daniel, I think it's great, and I've been able to get to know you a little bit. Are you able to hear me?
Yep, gotcha.
Gotcha. So we realize we're coming up on maybe some churches have prepared a little bit and have some type of cash reserve in case of emergency. Some churches, even regardless of size, may find themselves already kind of figuring out how to survive or pay bills or pay their pastor or whatever the case may be, even week by week. In the midst of the present times that we're in, we just want to have this conversation with you. What are some of the things that you're seeing that maybe expect the next day that lockdowns and quarantines continue? And then in addition to expectation, what are some of the good ways that churches and ministry leaders can be thinking about what to do next?
Certainly. So I think one of the most important things is to really take a deep breath, step back and realize that if you didn't sort of budget and plan for an epidemic, a pandemic, a quarantine, that you're not alone. There was no board, there was no lead pastor, XP that really sort of had this on the horizon. In fact, in dealing with for-profit companies, even major corporations who have now had to basically shutter and shut down, everybody knew that something like this was maybe a risk. And, you know, even biblically, we look at there's rhythms of feast and famine. But the aggressiveness of this, how steep sort of the whole decline went, both from an economic standpoint, but also how aggressive this pandemic spread was really beyond the imaginations of a lot of people outside of epidemiologists, or however you say the doctors actually study this stuff and have been telling us for a long time. So the first step is, as leaders, as a board, to take a step back, take a deep breath, pray through it, find composure, and realize that the spirit with which you lead is going to say a lot to your people. Now, going on to, looking at churches who maybe have not had reserves, who have maybe not been in the era of feast for quite a while. And so maybe they've been, just limping along. I think one of the things that they're going to take away from this, as they look forward and as they see light at the end of the tunnel, is sometimes feast times look a lot different than we think they do. And sometimes have a famine perspective, but we actually are in the midst of a feast. And so in those times, it might be better in hindsight to realize and be thankful for what we are. Leading through it right now, though, you're going to have to probably make some interesting decisions. That's probably on the horizon for your leadership. But before you get there, it's time to get creative. So if you have a good team of leaders around you and you love leading with them and you guys are passionate about the mission that you're doing, what God has called you to, it's time to start thinking outside of the box and be creative. I know our local church here, we just actually had a call over lunch, and we are praying prayers of thankfulness for this season because it's forcing us to do ministry in new and unique ways. And our conversation and takeaway for next week's meeting, which we'll again do over video at lunch unless something dramatically changes, is how are we going to take what we're doing now back with us when we go back to the new normal, right? How do we not just flip a switch and go, okay, let's shove all this away, but how do we actually incorporate some of the good parts of what's going on now? And so I think for leaders who've never done online giving, it's time to start. Everything has now moved to online. You do not have a choice to pass the plate now, proverbially, metaphorically, or literally. And so you need to engage with people in some online way. If you are uncomfortable with online, there's probably somebody in your congregation who is comfortable. Or if you're part of the Alliance or some denominational organization, there's partner churches there. And I think one of the big things we're going to see is partnerships really amplified, increased, or even begun because we're realizing as ministries that we're in this together.
That's good. Yeah. So let's talk about like zero-based budgeting. Can you just give us a really overarching, I think we've heard Dave Ramsey talk about some of this stuff before, if we've been through Financial Peace University, but how does an organization take it like month by month? Can you just get like kind of overarching, what is zero-based budgeting? And then how do you do it like starting April 1st? What needs to happen so that a church can start with zero? And how do you begin to even estimate the giving, right, that you're going to incur? Because I think it's going to be drastically different. So can you take us through a zero-based budget real quick?
Certainly. So for people who are not sort of the financial savants, or maybe you just roll your eyes at numbers, zero-based budgeting is very similar to what it sounds like. You have income, that's one part of your budget. You have expenses, that's the other part. And most nonprofits and even most financial gurus will preach making sure that your bottom line, your income less your expenses, equals zero. Now, that can mean that you create some expenses that are pushing things to reserves or savings if it's a personal budget, but that your bottom line essentially equals zero. And I think most of us who have served on boards of nonprofits or church finance teams, things like that, have realized that generally speaking, especially most nonprofits operate with, we will spend everything that we bring in, and then we'll sort of put in reserves what extra sort of comes in. Like if we have above and beyond gifts, or if we do special offerings for the building fund, etc. So odds are that most people came into March operating in a zero-based budget mentality. For some people, their fiscal year may start July 1, which means you're nearly 3/4 of the way through a zero-based budgeting, which means you don't have necessarily a lot of wiggle room. And so one of the important things to, I guess, really conceptually understand now and be going into, I guess, board meetings and financial team meetings is that budget is done. Like it's history, right? So your giving is going to change. Your benevolence is going to change. Your expenses will more than likely change because you're going to have to shift from category to category. So sort of after taking that deep breath and praying as a board and as a team and as a treasurer and as a lead pastor, like coming to the table and going, okay, historically we might have created a budget and said that, during the year we have to really stick on this budget. And if something changes, we're not going to change it to the next budget. But this is massively different. And this is no failure of teams or leadership. It's time to go, this budget is out the window. We now need to look at, like you said, starting April 1, what's the reality? And to figure out that reality, okay, if you have online giving, it's time to dive into those numbers. Get somebody who loves spreadsheets. It's a good way to engage new volunteers in your church, right? Hey, who loves finances and spreadsheets? We need your help now. And look at some of the giving that has been going on in the past, and look at, what we started in our ministries. We look at what's the recurring giving. What have people been giving on a regular and consistent basis? And what can we kind of count on being there? Understanding that a good percentage of those people actually also might be getting laid off too. So figure out what was reliable before, assign sort of a percentage that you're comfortable with, knocking that down to some extent. And then your next layer is to go into the inconsistent giving. And if your inconsistent giving was $1,000, to throw out a nice round number prior to this, that should be cut a lot more than your consistent giving. So if you mark down your consistent giving by, you say it's going to be 80% of what it was coming into March, going forward, it's going to be at the 80% level. You might mark down your inconsistent giving by like 50% or 60%, because your inconsistent givers either had inconsistent income, which means they're in the service industry, which have all pretty much been laid off, or they're not, for lack of a better sort of way to say it, they're not as engaged in owning the vision and mission of your church. And if they weren't engaged in owning the vision mission of your church before all of this happened, then facing financial adversity, if you're not stepping up to the plate and really calling people to own it and be a part of it, there's no reason for them to step up more right now than they were a couple weeks ago.
Wow, but there is a good opportunity, talking about vision, to cast vision in the midst of the crisis. This is how we're going to engage with this, and then being very real about, these are the resources that we need to tackle whatever God has positioned for us, and we feel like we're being held accountable by the Holy Spirit, right, to go after. So, man, I agree with you that vision is going to be the thing that's going to say, this is how we're going to do it, and then these are the practical ways that you can help us, because not everyone is getting smoked by this. There are still some sectors that are like massively growing and thriving, but a lot of them are getting just waylaid, of course. But no, I love that. What about like, okay, we don't have cash reserves, and we have a couple of staff members, and as we're going through the projected income, we're seeing the projected expense, and now we have to make this extraordinarily terrible call to say, we can't, our shortfall is such that we need to turn a person loose, right? We need to not fire, lay off a person. We can't continue to pay everybody. How is an elder team, a church board, ministry leadership, how are they? Give us some guardrails for that conversation to go down.
And Daniel, before you answer that, maybe let's take one step back and just say, how do you set priorities for spending?
Yeah.
Let's not go straight to the hatchet of staff members, although it may get to that point. How should a board think through spending priorities in the midst of a shortfall?
Certainly. So if you've not done, I guess, any strategic planning up to this point, it's now a really good time to start. Because one of the upsides of adversity and sort of going through these times is you are forced to look at what's important. In fact, in our business, we do a personal finance podcast, and we just were recording an episode earlier today, and we were talking through how you align your personal financial budget in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of job losses or changes, or for friends and family that are losing jobs. And the first thing that we did as a family, even though we have an emergency fund set up and we're not currently concerned about employment and things of that nature, is we still went through our entire monthly budget and said, what doesn't really make sense for us? Like, what does not, it was a nice comfort, it was a nice luxury a month or two ago, but currently it doesn't move the needle for us. And just allowing to cut those things. That, on a sort of a ministry level, is basically strategically looking through your budget, first figuring out what it is that you are called to as a ministry, as a church, as an organization, figuring out how you're going to measure success in those areas, and then what your strategies are to fulfill those, then working backwards in your budget. So you're now basically allocating funds, resources, whether that's funds, people, time, etc., to those various strategies. And as long as those strategies are accomplishing the wins that you set out, and the wins are accomplishing the reason that you exist, then they're worth spending money on. But if through that, this is not a safety, a security thing, and it doesn't really fit any of our wins and our sort of reason for existing, then why are we spending money on it at all? And so when we go through strategic planning, we call those our why, what, and how. So why is what is often called our mission statement, our reason for existence. Our what is our measure of success, what we're doing about our why, and our how is the strategies that we implement. All of your hows are going to take money. That might be your small group ministry, your kids ministry, your gathering, whatever. They're all going to take funds, but they should all be funded to the extent that they can really make an impact on your why, on your mission. And so you will over time have fluff in your budget, like just extra stuff that creeps in. It could be spending on technology. It could be spending on subscriptions for the worship team, that are nice to have. But now's the time to communicate to your staff. We are going to go through sort of a season of tightening, and it's time to look through what's not making a dent on propelling the ministry forward. It's comfortable. It feels good to have these things in our budget. They make our life easier even, but they're not necessarily helping propel our vision forward. If churches do that now, then coming out of this on the backside, they're going to be leaner, meaner, and more focused on that mission, that reason that they exist.
That's good. Yeah. So just to review, strategic planning, you got to know your why, your what, and your how. And what you said there was hows take money. And so, and in this time, and it doesn't have to be the next 15 years. We're not creating a strategic plan for the next 10. We're talking about the next, 4 months, 6 months, maybe the next 3 months. But this is what we're going to focus on. This is what we're going to hone into, and those are going to get the dollars. Am I hearing you right on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I wouldn't put any big timelines on it. I would say this is going to shift our thinking moving forward. Looking at, in our business, we're looking at, the data in the economy right now. And a lot of things point to this could be a deep jump down, sort of a propel down that bounces back quickly once they flip a switch and turn the lights back on in this country. But we can't bank on that. So I would be hesitant to tell any leader, hey, put a timeline on this. I would say, don't put a timeline on it. This is your new state of thinking. In fact, in our ministry team meeting today, we started thinking with, let's just assume that we're not going back to gathering right now. And let's plan for that. Let's stop having in our language right now, we'll work on that when we get back to gathering together, or, in a few weeks, we'll be able to get back. No, like, this is where we are. This is our now. Let's lead through this. And then once we get the green light to do other stuff, or once, people get employed again, or people start giving more again, that's when you start moving. So I would say, I would caution against moving ahead of that if there's not indicators and reasons to do so. But that'd be the practical side coming out.
No, that's great. Thank you. So if now, Josh, any other preliminary steps? Because I do think that guys like me just jump to I don't want to have to let anybody go, right? So once we have the income and expense figured out, we're trying to zero that out. Once we then have our what, why, and how, and we're still not at zero, now what do we do if we're starting to have staffing conversations? What does that look like, as an elder on an elder board? How do I need to start that conversation, or as a pastor or ministry leader, how do I need to start that conversation with my team to be real, to be authentic, and to lead well during that time?
So I would say from a leadership perspective, people are already expecting that. And so the sooner that you start moving towards addressing that elephant in the room, where the church is financially. So a lot of your staff probably have no idea where you were financially coming into this. Maybe you post it in your bulletin or on your website, but they've never looked at it before because you've gone through seasons of being okay. But they are now suddenly in the back of their head going, okay, I have parents or kids that have been laid off. I have, kids maybe at university that have been sent back home that I'm having to take care. Like, their life has changed. And in the back of their mind, they're starting to wonder, how is that affecting our organization? So we should already be having those conversations with leaders. Those should have happened probably in the last week or two already. If you haven't had them, I would start putting that on the calendar now. And I would not schedule it for Friday or Thursday's your last day of the week at the end of the day. because that's going to send a message, right? That another decision is already coming. So I would schedule those at a normal meeting time that is customary in your organization, but have a real honest perspective on, like, here's where we are financially and here's what's going on. And then it's up to the board to start making those tough decisions, if tough decisions come. And the ones, I guess, encouragement or suggestion that I would have to kind of boards everywhere, if they're listening, or senior leadership, is while we have to respect that these are actual people with actual lives, and we want to minister them through these transitions, because it's no fault of their own if we transition people off the team, right? Like, they still have mouths to feed in their house and so forth. They still have lives and stories and ways that God is going to use them as they transition to new places. But the fact of the matter is to give them the respect and dignity that they deserve. The sooner that we make that decision, and the longer runway that we give them via severance or support or benevolence, but the more that they have a concrete sort of perspective on what's happening next, the better. If we sort of string people along now for 6 weeks and then only give them a sort of a 2-week runway after that, that's going to do them a bigger disservice than having the honest conversation up front and giving them 2 to 3 months of sort of runway, understanding the known, because they are people. They do have feelings. They do sort of have to look at what's next. And we can, even though they might not be on our staff team at this point, still take ownership over ministering them through this life transition. That's
good. I was having a conversation with a colleague this morning, and we were talking about unemployment for workers of a church. Is unemployment, I would imagine, is being paid unemployment taxes, and all those types of things are good. So therefore, people who are losing their jobs in church and nonprofit ministry, am I correct in saying that they could go to the unemployment website and they can start filing and different things like that? Or am I wrong in that?
Generally speaking, they should. Now, this is a state by state sort of regulation. And so I'm not, unfortunately, familiar with all 50 states as they would go, or even other countries that might tune in. But generally speaking, there are social systems there and available. This is different from Social Security and Medicare, which some of our ministry partners might not be paying into. So know that unemployment is separate and distinct from that. And your employer is required, generally speaking, to be paying into that. Now, again, there may be some exceptions in a few states that I'm not aware of. You can check with your employer. They should have, if your employer has an HR department or a payroll company or something of that nature, there would be notices that they can give you. If you're kind of doing that all in-house as sort of a small business, then they might not have those, but you can call your state unemployment department. I would say if you're ministering somebody through that transition, or if you yourself are in that transition, be patient. I know, for instance, the state of Kentucky has had to switch to certain people whose last name starts with certain letters can only call on certain days to file for. I mean, the unemployment offices are swamped. They never expected to be this busy. Economically, the unemployment number we got this morning was 3.2 million people last week filed for unemployment. During 2008, 2009, in the depths of the financial crisis, the max number in 1 week was 800,000. So give that some perspective on what these poor government employees in the unemployment office are suddenly trying to handle, and what computers and websites and servers are starting to handle. They did not know to prepare for this either. So understand if you are going through that part of your ministry and your testimony is how you're talking to the people who are going to help you navigate this as well, whether or not they're a part of your ministry, a part of your church, et cetera. So give those people some love. Yeah. Because they are dealing with a lot of stressed out folks who are trying to figure out how to make ends meet. Now, the bill that is making its way through Congress right now is going to help with a lot of things, hopefully, if we can get it finalized. We're going to see what happens there over the next couple of weeks, but potentially there's money coming out to folks via a check, as well as potentially increasing some of those unemployment benefits. And so be on the lookout for that. We don't know the final details of what's coming out, but know that there will be some additional assistance in there. The government, regardless of what you think of Congress, administration, et cetera, right now, is looking at this whole situation as disaster relief, right? So they're looking at this as if a hurricane hit the entire country, and are trying to really support America in doing that. And so in a bipartisan way, they're really trying to look at this as not bailing out any particular person or entity or thing, but in really trying to provide relief as if this was a disaster. So understand, like, it's okay to take that.
Yeah.
What has happened is pretty unprecedented, at least in our lifetimes and in the generation that went before us. So there's no shame, that there's no stigma in that. So
it's good. No, I appreciate that. And even like, for the LEAD program, for example, like, thankfully we've not heard from many students, but I'm listening to students and trying to think through, like, how will that impact tuition for the LEAD program, their ability to pay and everything like that. But even thinking about like mortgages on buildings for churches and that sort of stuff. Like, can you talk to me about like so there are maybe debts that these ministries have, or their income is going to be significantly reduced. Like, let's just focus on debt, for example. So, I mean, what can you do with a lending institution about the mortgage? So, I mean, if you're just really crippled, you have a mortgage, what can a leader do reaching out to lending organizations? Like, I don't know if a payment could be deferred, or are you seeing any relief? I mean, I'm getting notices from the banks that we use, but what would your like general advice be for mortgages and where we've taken out loans?
So I would say absolutely reach out to any lenders that you interact with. That could be mortgages, that could be church credit cards. You might have a credit card through one of the big national banks or so forth. But I would be reaching out to those on the front end. Even if right now you don't think that you're going to run into a budget issue, I would start the conversation, because by the time you start seeing a dip in giving or expenses start to overwhelm the income, it may be a little late to start having those conversations, because you're going to run into some of just the bottleneck of paperwork, the red tape, et cetera, that goes through some of these kind of crises as those systems get overwhelmed. So even if you're in a good place right now, I would call up your lender and just go, hey, there's a lot going on right now. We are fine currently, but let's talk. If things change in a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, what are the options that we can have on the table? If you're already at that point, I would get on the phone with them in the next day or two, talk about it as a board, but I would start having those conversations and engaging those banks and going, what is the option here? One, you're going to have to want to make sure that you are kind of in line with any covenantal agreements that you had as far as your loan goes. So people who maybe lead from a personal finance standpoint sometimes don't realize that when it comes to commercial loans and debts and so forth, that it's not always simply as simplistic as we're just going to pay an amount every month, and as long as we do that, we're okay.
Yeah.
There's actually some reserve requirements that come along with some of these commercial mortgages and so forth, that you have to have X amount in the bank. So now that is only amplified, right? Because now you're starting to cut into your reserves, but certain banks are going to require you to have a set amount of reserves to be in the covenants of the debt that you make. Now, that's not super typical, but we have seen that before, even at churches. And so understanding, if you inherited a leadership position that entails debt, to understand what the actual details of that debt are. Is it very simple? Or are there other sort of intricacies in play that you want to make sure that you're in good standing with, that you had never maybe had a reason to think of before? But lenders do have leeway. And what it's going to come down to is whether or not you have a bank that is servicing your loan, or an organization that's servicing your loan, or actually owning your loan. So I know a lot of our churches go through nonprofit organizations or lending institutions that are tied into nonprofit organizations, and they hold the loan. If they hold the loan, you are going to have a lot more options, because they are the ones that are receiving the benefit from the loan. If you're working through basically a servicing agency, which is an intermediary, a lot of people run into this with their mortgages. They send a check to somebody, but that person doesn't benefit except through pass-through fees, right? And then they send that money on to somebody else. If you have a servicing organization, they really don't have any wiggle room to actually negotiate with you, because then they have to go to the person behind them in line and try to get agreement for what terms you're going to discuss.
Okay.
But generally speaking, in this type of situation, there's going to be some forbearance, some putting off payments and so forth that you'll be able to do that you wouldn't necessarily have thought you could do a couple months ago. That's not a guarantee. A mortgage or debt is a contract. And, scripturally, as Christians, we should try to live up to that contract as much as humanly possible. But if you're finding that margin doesn't work anymore, having that conversation early and honestly is going to benefit you a lot more than waiting till times become really tight.
That's good. Josh, I wanted to there's a couple of questions in the comments. So Daniel, I'll let you go first, but this question is from Matthew McKenzie, and it's concerning online giving services. So let me read the question. What do you guys suggest as far as doing offerings as a part of an online service? We're looking at including our Sunday offering into the pre-recorded video, directing our people toward online giving. So they're thinking about calling their people into mission, but realizing the fact that we have many tuning in that are far from Jesus and looking for answers at this time and not wanting the offering. They're afraid that it could be a turnoff. So is it better to just send out a letter, or should we just go for it online? What suggestion would we give to Matthew in his question?
Is Josh taking it first, or do you want me to?
Go ahead, Daniel. I'll let you go, and then Josh can check.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Great. So I would say don't shy away from communicating your vision and asking people if they want to engage in sacrificing for the sake of that vision. If your vision is bigger and greater than simply we want to make sure our staff are paid, right? So if you just want to service debt and pay staff, and that's the extent of your organization's vision, and I would assume if you're listening to Lead live that's probably not the limitation on your thinking, right? But let's just put that out there. If that's kind of where you're at, like you're at the point where, hey, our vision is just to get by, just get through this season. People do not want to give to that because these are people who just stocked up on groceries for a month because they are afraid for their hierarchy of needs, right? They want to make sure their family's okay. They want to make sure they have food on the table. They're concerned about getting a potentially life-threatening virus, okay? So that's the reality that we're facing. So coming out and going, our ministry is a little light on cash. We don't want to fire anybody, and we're worried about our debt. That's not the right conversation to have. The right conversation to have in these instances, and the one that people will respond to, and I don't mean this manipulatively, I'm just sharing with you exactly sort of what we would do and what's appropriate for the church, is this. The church is on a very unique mission. And that is to bring a light into people's lives and to point them to something bigger than this world, bigger than this virus, and to call people into mission together to do that, not just alone, not afraid in their houses. And that's no knock on what our governments have asked us to do. But that's the situation people are in right now. They're alone and afraid in their houses by themselves. But God has called us through Christ to be in community together and to be caring for one another. And the church is his unique vehicle for doing that. And if you as a church have that vision, then call people to fund it. And then don't be afraid at pointing people to what you're actually doing to live that out. And this is a time that the church, as we look back on this period, that the church should be reflected on as actually bringing sort of a light and hope into the world. I know a week or two ago, I was discussing it with a pastor friend in town, and we were just discussing what some of the different churches were doing and so forth. And it basically came across this way: like, this is the time for the church to be hope and light into people's lives.
Yep.
And if the church can't communicate that vision, and if it ceases doing that, then you have to really look at whether or not you have a church that is the bride of Christ anymore, right? Because if you're not breathing in hope and if you're not breathing in light, then why would people give at that point?
Right.
But if if you're feeding people, if you're spreading the gospel, if you're still doing great things, why wouldn't people want to be a part of that? They are going to give somewhere. They're going to help support their local restaurants. They're going to help support other organizations that are going to do great things in this time. And so call them to be a part of that with you, especially if they're a part of. Now, people who don't know Jesus, giving in an odd way, giving right now may be their first step towards committing their life to Jesus. Giving $5, $10 right now, and then having a sort of a sense of ownership in this mission that your church is on could be a stepping stone for them eventually giving their entire life beyond that money. So just consider that that's their opportunity to join in the game. And there's no shame in that.
Right. Josh, anything to add? That was a beautiful response. What else would you share?
No, I agree 100% with what Daniel said, is that this is the time to talk about it. Like, so often some church leaders are afraid to talk about money and finances. And this is the time to say that we really believe that God has called us to be a part of what he's doing in the community now, to serve people that are in need. And so one of the things that we've done at the church that I help lead is to set up a specific COVID-19 relief fund to give to. And we have people from outside of our church family that are eager to jump in to contribute to that. We've said any money that goes towards that is going to help feed kids that rely on, their school for breakfast and lunch. And now they basically don't have the means for that. And so we're going to help our local schools. We're going to help inner city ministries that are helping to meet that need. And then also, I think in response to the question in the comments is, don't feel like you can only talk about money during your online service. You now have a whole new world of communication that's open to you. And what we used to always load up for Sunday morning, and we try to always communicate everything that's important in that hour, an hour and a half, you now have people's attention almost 24/7, and they're looking for encouragement and leadership and direction and what they should do with their money. Because as Daniel said, their primary concern right now is, how do I provide for myself and my family? And so even on social media, we're posting things like, hey, go bless a teacher, go bless a medical worker, go support, we have Takeout Tuesdays, go buy a gift card to your favorite restaurant and give it to your neighbor or something like that. And so it's not just, hey, support the church, but it's how do we disciple people into not think selfishly all the time?
Right.
And so if you can do that in their areas of normal interaction, restaurants, relationships, then they'll be more interested in growing in that, because generosity, like faith, is a muscle. And the more you practice it, the greater it grows. And so I think if you can get creative in some of those other ways as well, it'll continue to build bridges to what God is doing in your church.
No, that's good. There's another comment. It's not a question, just a straight comment from Phil Howard. He says, Max Dupree once wrote that the primary role of a leader is to define reality. And so doing that intentionally and graciously, redemptively, is a significant challenge, but that is the role of a leader. And so, I think back to Matthew's question is like, call people into something greater. And as you're trapped in your house, in many cases, I am like, I want to get involved somehow, and I want to get involved safely, and I want to have an impact, right? And doing so financially could be one of those avenues for people to get involved with something that they don't, because a tornado blows down somebody's house. We just send groups of people, and they go back and they help clean up the debris, and they feel like they've accomplished something, they've done something. This is very much different, where we still have to keep this, physical distance from one another, but we want to be socially connected. And so I feel like this might be one of those ways to provide connectivity through our finances during this time. And they can say, I was a part of a hunger relief fund, and I was a part of this backpack thing, and I was a part of this other avenue of just getting America back together and really trying to put my hands on people, right, when I can't. And I think that's, especially for the church, that's the wrestling match that we're in. Is like, I want to be tangibly connected to people. And this giving may be one of the best tangible expressions of our heart and wanting to help people during this time. Guys, let's see. I'm just making some notes. I'm kind of going down through. We talked about budgets. We talked about cash reserves. We've talked about strategic planning and the why, what, and how. We talked about having early and honest conversations with employees, staff, pastors, and administrators. What else is on our minds? Josh, Daniel, what else is on your minds concerning finances and faith?
I think the thing that came to mind for me, just talking about how do you define the current reality, I think there's three primary areas when it comes to communicating about finances and giving that may be helpful for church leaders. And that's that you want to make sure you define the current reality with a sense of hope a sense of purpose. You can participate in the purpose and the sense of community. So there's going to be a brighter day if we do this together, right? If you can communicate those things, I think that is really how you'll capture people's hearts. You frame it in what God is asking you to do as a church. There will be a brighter day if we do these things together, is really what people are longing for right now.
That's good. Daniel, what else is on your mind as you think about this conversation, just from your practical and your experience, as a financial advisor and planner?
Absolutely. I think if leaders and boards don't have a diverse sort of gift mix around them, because maybe they've been comfortable for a while, the conversations that we're about to start going through as ministry teams and leaders is going to require that. So if you have a ton of sort of pastoring, shepherding sort of people on your board, and they are just 100% leading out in faith, it may be a good time to engage some apostolic and sort of number crunchers and sort of objective reality people that are going to go, okay, yes, we want to lead in faith, but we want to have, an eye on sort of defining what that reality is. If your board is a very business board, and they've really helped lead the church strongly and helped grow it, they're just that apostolically minded folks, and maybe God has gifted you in that way that's worked well. In this season, you might need to engage some of those people with a high faith quotient, a high pastoral, a high shepherding quotient that's really going to, one, think about people in this time and what those decisions mean to people, what some of these changes will dramatically change people's lives if they do come about, and how we do need to keep an element of faith in a lot of these decisions we make. And not just an element, like all of these decisions have to be made with faith, right? So we're going to make some concrete decisions, but we also have to continue to lead out in faith. But you're going to want to make sure there's a balance of those different gifts on your team. Otherwise, if you swing too heavily in one way now, it can get really contentious as you continue to go through. And you're either going to make good and bad decisions really quickly, or you're going to make no decisions, but be very confident that God has it taken care of in the long run. And somewhere in the middle of that is where you need to land and allow those teams to really build off one another. It's not a one-person show. It's not a one-gift show, but a diverse group of people that bring everything together.
Well, that's good. All right, guys, we're almost to our 45-minute time frame, so let's do final thoughts. Josh, go ahead first. In this topic of faith and finance, what's your final thought?
Yeah, I think my final thought would be, don't be afraid to talk about it, and don't be afraid to talk about it in new and creative ways, and invite people to participate in what God wants to do through your church's impact in your community.
That's great. Daniel, final thought.
The gospel costs zero money to spread and communicate. Okay? Like, everything we do to creatively do that is what costs the money, but really spreading the gospel costs zero. So now is the time to start rethinking your ministry and the way forward and what that looks like. Let the giving and the offering and the church budget be everybody's good gifts coming together to then be distributed and the gospel put into action. But start thinking forward that you don't really need anything to spread the gospel throughout the world. Start there, and then see where your budget goes after that.
So that's going to be really hard to follow for my final thought. So I don't even know if I'm going to give. No, I think you guys are right. I mean, you've got to call people in. This is the opportunity again, creativity, innovation, and we've got to move forward. We can't sit still in this time. This is when we as leaders pony up. We rise to the occasion and we start to say, and framing things up, we're going to follow Jesus. This is where we're going to go. And everybody will then normalize that optimism, faithfulness, and practicality. We don't want to just be pie in the sky. It's all, hey, just strap yourself in your house. You'll be fine. And then, in 2 weeks later, we're going to pop out and everything's going to be great. We do have to have realism and realistic expectations on this. But leaders, if we're not looking at these types of things that Daniel and Josh and I have been talking about in these last 45 minutes, if you're going to bury your head in the sand, you need to move out of the way and let somebody else rise to the occasion, But now is the time to talk about, yes, our faithfulness to Jesus and how he is faithful to us. Absolutely. And we also have to talk about the practicalities of the finances. And we got to get down and dirty with it in order to see what's essential and what's not essential. Guys, thanks so much for the conversation today. Daniel, you've been great. I could listen to you for the next hour. Give us the podcast. Where can we find it? What's the name of it so that I can tune in later on in my office and listen to the financial advice? What's the podcast?
Nice. So if you're looking for sort of personal finance, it's DIY Money. So just search in the iTunes store or Stitcher podcast it's also on Spotify. DIY Money. Me and my partner Quint, we take one listener question every week and dive into personal finance. The episode coming out this Sunday is going to be focused primarily on what do we do in this environment with our personal finances in the midst of a pandemic, and how do we really look at that? So we do 2 episodes a week. It's just kind of really entertaining, fun personal finance.
That's awesome. Hey, thanks for joining us, Daniel. I do appreciate it. Josh, thanks for tuning in via the car. I do appreciate that very much. It was very nice.
Oh my goodness. Listen, cabin fever was real in the Franks household, so we had to get out.
Oh.
We went to a state park and just hiked around and got muddy, and we feel so much better because of it.
Oh, that's good.
So thanks for
nice
dealing with me in the car.
Yeah. Yeah, thankfully we've been able to get outside in the backyard. Cole and I have been throwing the football a lot here lately. We got Lorena a rabbit, so she's been walking a rabbit around, which is really hilarious, and got lots of that. So we're keeping ourselves entertained here for sure. But leaders, thanks for joining us today. We appreciate you. We love you. We're for you in this. Leave more comments. We'll be monitoring that as we go along. Every week, we're trying to give you 2 opportunities to talk with some experts in different fields. If you have topics where we want to hear your topics, so you can hit us up at Lead CMA, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. We're there. If you've got topics that you want discussed, we can bring those to you. We want to engage with you in this really unprecedented time where leadership is absolutely essential. So guys, thanks for joining, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.